Woodrow Wilson and Herbert Crowley and John Dewey, what they learn is the depth of the crisis. They know the surface manifestations of it. They know the symptoms, but they don't necessarily know what the fundamental disease or the fundamental health of the regime could be. See, they don't see that yet. I always tell the students, you're not really learning from me. You're learning about American foreign policy, for example, from John Quincy Adams. You're learning about the Constitution from James Madison. You're learning about progressivism from Woodrow Wilson. You're learning it from them.
Hello, my name is John. I am a senior majoring in American Studies here at Hillsdale College. This is part of a 10-week course, Constitution 101, presented by Hillsdale College. Today you will be hearing from Dr. Will Morrissey, the William and Patricia Lamoth Chair in the U.S. Constitution and Associate Professor of Politics, on the separation of powers, ensuring good government. Please watch.
Americans declared and won their independence from the British Empire in order to prevent the continued violation of their unalienable natural rights, rights ordained by the laws of nature and of nature's God. A person, George III, collaborating with a group of persons, the British Parliament, had violated those rights. But it takes persons organized into a regime to violate rights systematically. That is, in the way described by the Declaration of Independence. That wasn't just a series of random acts, in other words, that list of violations of their rights that was given in the Declaration. That was something that had been thought out in advance and had been implemented in an orderly and deliberate way. Now, similarly, it's going to take another regime, a very different kind of regime, to secure those rights systematically. To secure the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the Declaration tells us, governments are instituted among men. That is the purpose of the United States Constitution. As Publius puts it in the 51st Federalist paper, justice is the end, that is to say, the purpose of government. It's the end of civil society. It ever has been and ever will be pursued until it be obtained or until liberty be lost in the pursuit. Okay, then what is justice? Justice, he says in Federalist 43, consists of security for the rights of humanity. That is to say, the framers of the Constitution answer the call of the Declaration. Well, then what does the Constitution constitute? Our Constitution constitutes the federal government of the United States of America. It constitutes the supreme ruling offices or institutions of the American regime and also defines the relationship of those offices with other levels of American government, the states, the counties, the municipalities. The Constitution also stipulates how those federal offices will be filled by those who will wield their ruling powers, powers delegated to them by the true rulers, the American people under God. Ruling offices or institutions give a certain shape or form to political society. They channel the energies and ambitions of citizens in specified directions while discouraging those energies and ambitions from going in other directions. Think of a power grid. If you have energy, electricity going along a power grid, you build the power grid to direct that energy, that electricity in certain directions and not to direct it in other directions. That's what ruling institutions do in a political society. The Constitution thus constitutes the institutional or formal structure of the American regime, a regime dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal in their humanity. Okay, then, what's a regime? According to classical political science, a regime consists of three dimensions, and I've written them on the board over here. The first dimension is what I was just talking about, the ruling institutions or the form of the regime. The second dimension is the ruling persons. Who rules? And when you're thinking of the who rules, you're also thinking of whether they're good or bad, whether they're of good or bad character. So, for example, you might have one ruling, you might have a few ruling, or you might have many ruling. But it's crucially important, isn't it, that those persons be good rather than bad. A good king would be all right. Someone like Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, a contemporary monarch who rules well. On the other hand, you certainly don't want someone like Mao Zedong or George III, for that matter, ruling you. That's a qualitative distinction. The other dimension of the American regime, and any regime, is the way of life that the people have. They wanted the American way of life to be good. The way of life of a political society is what makes regimes matter for everyone in that society. The way you think of your life, the way you conceive of your life prospects for yourself and for your family, the habits of your heart and mind. These are decisively influenced by those ruling institutions and by those ruling persons which prevail in the country in which you live. We speak of the American way of life. In the Bible, God speaks of His way, under His laws and under His ruling institutions. God has a regime, especially in the Old Testament. In today's Iran, the rulers call for and enforce, and the ruling institutions reinforce yet another way of life under another set of laws, the Sharia, and so on. In all countries of the world, this prevails. Now, why does it matter? Well, consider my mother, Rose Wagner, born in Cliffwood Beach, New Jersey, 1912, one of eventually 9 children. Their parents came from Poland in 1900. What if they'd stayed in Poland? What if Rose Watzira, not Wagner, had been in Galicia instead of Cliffwood Beach? Well, she would have had the same DNA, biologically the same person, identical. But the Polish Rose Wagner would have had a different regime. Initially, she would have had a regime, and right after World War I, she would have enjoyed a regime growing up similar to an American regime, a republic. But in 1939, the Nazis rolled in. And in 1945-46, the communists rolled in, and she would have lived the rest of her life under that regime. That means she would have been the same person? Well, in a way, of course. But in a way, no. Her life prospects, her whole attitude toward life would have been fundamentally different. That's why regimes matter. Because of what happened to Rose Wagner and what didn't happen to her. And what's happened to all of us, what we owe our regime. Today we want to talk about one aspect of the institutional or formal dimension of the American regime and why it lends itself not only to limited but also to good government. The framers organized our ruling offices both vertically and horizontally. The vertical form of our ruling offices or institutions is called federalism. There are 4 levels of government in our regime, right? The overall federal government, of course, the states, the counties, the municipalities. This structure prevents the United States from becoming entirely centralized or top-heavy, overbearing. Every citizen can participate in self-government not only by voting for candidates for office on each of these levels of government, but you can also participate in the actual governing itself if in no other way than going to a town meeting and having your say, or maybe serving on a school board or a committee that wants to get something done in your community. This gives each of us the chance to gain practical understanding of governance. It prevents Americans from becoming utopians. it also gives Americans the character and the wherewithal to push back against encroachments upon their self-government by a centralized administrative state. It accustoms us to pursue happiness in a way that's grounded in reality. This sensible self-government is our way of life. Now, I've been asked to discuss not this vertical organization of our ruling institutions, our federalism, but the horizontal organization of our federal institutions, the way in which the framers separated and balanced the ruling powers of our elected and appointed representatives. Now, Dr. Arnn is very intent on talking about the difference that republicanism or representative government means to popular government. And he contrasts the direct democracy of ancient Athens, where the citizens would all gather in one place to vote, to discuss, and then to vote. He says the thinking and the action are come right after one another. This tends to lead to impulsiveness or passion in the government. Right? But the founders, he says, by establishing the representative principle, they don't do that. What they do is to put time between the popular thought and deliberation and the time that their representatives then go and actually enact what the people want to have them do. Okay, but that puts the problem on another level, doesn't it? Because what's to prevent the representatives from acting impulsively? They get to Washington or to the state capitol, and they then discuss and immediately vote on something. What's to stop them from doing the same thing that an Athenian popular assembly would do? Well, the framers solved that problem by constructing what Publius calls a compound republic. Under our first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, Congress consisted of only one house, not two. Further, it wielded legislative and executive and judicial powers. At the same time, this Congress depended for its funding upon the cooperation of the state governments. This meant that federal powers were all concentrated in one set of hands, but those powers were too weak. That set of hands was too weak to threaten Americans with tyranny, with this overbearing state, national state. Unfortunately, the problem was that the American government was also too weak really to govern at all. And therefore, it was too weak to secure rights, and therefore, it was too weak to do what governments are instituted to do. The new Constitution of 1787 allotted real powers to the federal government, including national defense, treaty making, regulation of interstate commerce, but most pertinently, it had the power to raise revenues without going to the states. It was enabled to raise revenues directly from the people. But why wouldn't that mean that the government would become overbearing, just the way the British monarchy and Parliament had become overbearing? Why would it not recapitulate that tyranny? Well, the framers solved that problem by then dividing the government, dividing the federal government into the three branches, and further divided the most powerful branch, the legislative branch, into two co-equal chambers, going from the unicameralism of the Articles of Confederation Congress to the bicameralism of the Congress we know today. The separation of legislative, judicial, and executive powers and the institutional balance of these powers remains one of the most distinctive features of American republicanism, quite different, for example, from what you see in a place like Great Britain or Israel. Compound republicanism makes popular government more moderate and more just by forcing it to act slowly and deliberately. A republic with all powers centered in one ruling body, or a democracy in which all citizens vote policies up or down directly, will incline toward a kind of groupthink, an impassioned surge of opinions that may, as Publius says, vote to poison Socrates one day and to erect statues to him the next. 173 despots would surely be as oppressive as one, Publius observes. In other words, legislative deadlock, very often a result of compound republicanism, isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's a better thing than legislative impulsiveness, which may trample on our natural rights. And Professor Porteous has already called your attention to one of Publius's statements in the 47th Federalist, paraphrasing Thomas Jefferson. The accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judicial, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether self-appointed or elected, may justly be constituted the very definition of tyranny. That is, even a Republican regime may tyrannize if its ruling institutions concentrate ruling authority in one body of representatives. In this, both Publius and Jefferson followed the great French political philosopher Montesquieu, who wrote, "There can be no liberty where the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person or body of magistrates." Such a threat to liberty, which would consist of gathering all powers in one body of people, such a threat to liberty simultaneously means a threat to life as well, as Montesquieu, Jefferson, and Madison all learned from John Locke, the English political philosopher, who wrote the following in his second treatise of government. "He who attempts to get another man in his absolute power does thereby put himself into a state of war with him, it being to be understood as a declaration of a design upon his life. For I have reason to conclude that he who would get me into his power without my consent would use me as he pleased when he got me there, and destroy me too if he had a fancy to it. For nobody can desire to have me in his absolute power unless it be to compel me by force to that which is against the right of my freedom, that is, to make me a slave." While such terms as separation and balance of powers may seem rather dry and dull, what these institutions they describe do for us is anything but dry and dull. They're indispensable to our happiness, to our liberty, and to our lives. So, how is this going to work? How did the framers design the federal institutions so that separation and balance of powers would work in the real world and not merely on paper? If the people are the sovereigns, if we are to govern ourselves, then we must make our own laws. Under the terms of the 1787 Constitution, the House of Representatives represents the people more directly than does any other branch. And also, the bar of entry to the Congress is not high. You only need to be 25 years of age. You only need to have been a citizen for 7 years, right? You need to come from the state that you're going to represent, and you need to hold no other federal office while you're serving in the House. Quote, "Under these reasonable limitations, the door of this part of the federal government is open to merit of every description, whether native or adoptive, whether young or old, and without regard to poverty or wealth, or to any particular profession of religious faith." These representatives are only going to be serving for 2 years at a time. As it is essential, Publius writes, as it is essential to liberty that the government in general should have a common interest with the people, so it is particularly essential that the branch of it under consideration, that is to say the House of Representatives, should have an immediate dependence and an intimate sympathy with the people. That is, a dependence ensured by frequent elections. If so, I've heard it said, why are there so many congressional millionaires? And why do some of them serve so long in safe seats? Does this not look very much like oligarchy? Well, the fault, my dear citizens, my dear fellow citizens, lies not in the Constitution. It lies with ourselves. We voted those millionaires in. And if you don't want to be represented by millionaires, don't vote for them. And if political parties often nominate millionaires because millionaires, after all, can bankroll their own campaigns, why not join a political party and prevent that from happening? A sizable plurality of Americans consist of independents these days, which means many of us have voluntarily shut ourselves out of the nominating process. What counts, anyway, isn't so much whether these people are millionaires, but whether they vote to advance the interests of millionaires at the expense of the other 99%. Publius himself addresses this issue in Federalist number 57. If it be asked, what is to restrain the House of Representatives from making legal discriminations in favor of themselves and a particular class of the society? I answer, the genius of the whole system. That means the character of the whole system. That's 18th century talk. Genius is the character of the system. The nature of just and constitutional laws. And above all, the vigilant and manly spirit which actuates the people of America. A spirit which nourishes freedom and in turn is nourished by it. If this spirit shall ever be so far debased as to tolerate a law not obligatory on the legislature as well as on the people will be prepared to tolerate anything but liberty. Thus, the most nearly democratic branch of our Republican government requires vigilance and courage in the people. It's the one that's closest to us. It's the one that we have the most direct control over. If we aren't manly and vigilant, which means courageous and vigilant, then it won't operate as it was intended. Recall the observation from Federalist number 55, which Professor Porteous has previously quoted. As there is a degree of depravity in mankind which requires a certain degree of circumspection and distrust, so there are other qualities in human nature which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence. Republican government presupposes the existence of these qualities in a higher degree than any other form. If there is not sufficient virtue among men for self-government, Publius says, then nothing less than the chains of despotism can restrain them from destroying and devouring each other. All right, so what happens when on those times when human depravity prevails? The framers knew that there would be such times, and they acted to limit the damage. On those occasions when the members of the House, in Publius's words, forget their obligations to their constituents and prove unfaithful to their important trust, the other branch of the federal legislature serves to, and he says, double the security of the people. In other words, dividing the legislative powers doubles the security of the people, just as folding a piece of paper in half will double the strength of the paper. The Senate does this in two ways. By requiring all laws, including the budget, win approval in the Senate as well as in the House, the framers slowed down the act of legislating. Few laws can win quick and therefore thoughtless passage. By allotting 6-year terms to the senators, the framers enabled them to learn their business, namely the art of legislating itself. To survive a senatorial scrutiny, a bill is likely to be much more carefully drafted than it might have been had it been the product of the relative amateurs of the House of Representatives. Longer terms also permit the senators to think in the long term, to be less the prey of the passion for change. The founders are not particularly fond of rapid change. Publius says that excessive change in policy, and here I'm quoting, poisons the blessings of liberty itself. It will be of little avail to the people that the laws are made by men of their own choice if the laws be so voluminous that they cannot be read, or so incoherent that they cannot be understood, if they undergo such incessant changes that no man who knows what the law is today can guess what it will be tomorrow. Law is defined to be a rule of action, but how can that be a rule which is little known and less fixed? Constant change in laws, in other words, threatens the rule of law itself. Why is this so? Well, Publius explains, under such conditions, he says, only the sagacious, the enterprising, and the moneyed few, the sagacious, the enterprising, the moneyed few, in other words, the rich people and their lawyers, right, can function effectively. And he goes on, a state of things in which it may be said with some truth that laws are made for the few and not for the many. Ultimately, an ever-changing system of laws is no system at all. It sacrifices the respect the people feel for the laws themselves, their respect for the rule of law itself, and above all, for their own republican regime. Without a bicameral legislature, without the stability given to that legislature by the deliberative and well-informed Senate, a Republican people will begin to lose the very virtues, the very character which alone guarantee a decent legislature altogether. Fickle, ever-changing, ever-impassioned lawmakers shirk what Publius in Federalist 63 calls a due responsibility in the government to the people. The people must be able to hold their representatives accountable for the laws that they pass. A here today, gone tomorrow legislature will evade such responsibility as new members blame the old ones for present ills and then disappear before their once fashionable follies begin to plague the country. To sum it up, legislative bicameralism, coupled with short terms for House members, longer terms for senators, enables each branch to check and balance the bad tendencies of the other branch, and then to supply the strengths which the other branch lacks. The House gives the Republic fidelity to the people, particularly to what they want right now. The Senate gives the Republic steadiness, fidelity to the longer-term good of the people. Together, they can produce decent laws, laws that we can consent to and live with. Now, that's the legislative branch. The executive branch, the president, doesn't make laws. He executes the laws the legislators make. That's why it's called the executive branch. All he's there to do is to execute the laws of the legislature. What good are the best laws, after all, if they're not enforced, or if they're enforced incompetently? As Publius writes in Federalist 70, energy in the executive is the leading character in the definition of good government. Energy in the executive is the leading character of good government. Only an energetic executive can protect citizens against foreign attacks and domestic insurrections. Only an energetic executive can provide, Publius says, the steady administration of the laws. Only such an executive can protect liberty, private property, and against the enterprises and assaults of ambition, of faction, and of anarchy. Weak execution of laws, Publius adds, is but another phrase for bad execution. And a government ill executed, whatever it may be in theory, must be in practice a bad government. A strong executive needs 4 institutionally protected characteristics. The first of these is unity. We have but one president. President Truman famously said, "The buck stops here." 2 or more presidents, an executive council of some sort, would only lead to bickering, finger-pointing, backstabbing, more so than you get in any form of government, right? All forms of government are going to have that to some extent, but this will minimize it in the executive branch. So that's the first characteristic, unity of the executive. Second characteristic of a strong executive is duration in office. The president's 4-year renewable term in office will give him a stake in the office of the presidency itself. If he was just there for a year or so, he really wouldn't care about the office. He wouldn't defend it. He'd have no motive. He'd be gone. What would he care? But this gives him the reason to defend the office against any attempt at legislative encroachment upon executive authority. While the laws of Congress that the Congress enacts set down the aims of the government, legislators and the people they represent do not always, Publius says, they don't always reason right about the means of promoting those aims. To intend the public good is not to know how to obtain the public good. A 4-year term in office gives the executive time to design what Publius calls a system of administration. Right? That is, an orderly way in which to enforce the laws of the land. Notice that the Constitution doesn't call for presidents who lead public opinion. It rather provides them with the wherewithal to follow the intentions of public opinion, of the public, as expressed by legislative enactments with energy and with intelligence. Speaking of wherewithal, the third characteristic of a sound executive office is adequate provision for its support. Congress passes the budget, it therefore must set the salary of the executive. But if it could manipulate that salary to reward a pliable president or to punish an independent-minded president, it could dominate him. The Constitution expressly prohibits Congress from altering a president's salary during his term of office. Finally, a president must wield what Publius calls competent powers. These include not only command of the military, but not only the authority to negotiate treaties, but also the power to veto legislation the president deems imprudent or unjust. As Publius puts it in Federalist 71, when occasions present themselves in which the interests of the people are at variance with their inclinations, it is the duty of the persons they have appointed to be the guardians of those interests to withstand the temporary delusion in order to give them time and opportunity for cool and sedate reflection. That is, the president provides a second line of defense after the Senate against the tyranny of impassioned majorities legislating advantages to themselves. Over the long run, this will make American self-government better. Now, all right, if that's the case, he can certainly veto bad laws. Why couldn't he equally veto good laws? He certainly could. Publius acknowledges this. But he also says the injury which may possibly be done by defeating a few good laws will be amply compensated by the advantage of preventing a number of bad ones. See how careful they are. They really don't want a bill to become a law unless it has been carefully planned, carefully deliberated, fully aired by the public and by a variety of branches of government. Laws need to be framed and executed. They also need to form the basis of judgments in court. The Supreme Court, our third branch of government, consists of judges with lifetime tenure, removable only upon appointment, death, disability, or impeachment for bad behavior. Publius calls, quote, the standard of good behavior for the continuance in office of the judicial magistracy to be certainly one of the most valuable of the modern improvements in the practice of government, providing an excellent barrier to the encroachments and oppressions of the representative body, the legislature. Now, given the existence in America of a written constitution, one that was ratified by the sovereign people, acting through the states, our Supreme Court can say what the supreme law of the land is. In so doing, it can strike down congressional enactments that seem to them to be at variance with the supreme law, which is the people's law. As Chief Justice John Marshall wrote in his famous 1803 decision, Marbury versus Madison, a legislative act contrary to the Constitution is not law. Now, what prevents this power to say what the supreme law of the land is from becoming a power to tyrannize? In other words, what if the justices lie about what the supreme law of the land is? Recall the powers of the other two branches of government. The legislature, Publius observes, not only commands the purse, but prescribes the rules by which the duties and rights of every citizen are to be regulated. The president not only dispenses the honors, but holds the sword of the community. In other words, Congress has the will of the political community, it expresses the will of the political community, that the president wields the force of the political community. The Supreme Court has no more, but also no less, than judgment. A judgment, Publius says, that must ultimately depend upon the aid of the executive arm, even for the efficacy of its judgments. In other words, to take an example, the very same Justice John Marshall, who enunciated the doctrine of judicial review of government acts, was stymied by President Andrew Jackson, who said in response to another court case, "Justice Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." This shows how the three powers of the federal government can check one another, prevent one another from tyrannizing. Each of the three branches governs by the consent of the others, just as the government overall governs by our consent. This may help to prevent bad government and to give good government a chance, but it doesn't show how the government might actually do good, enact and enforce coherent sets of policies over time. Would separation and balance of powers merely paralyze all government, leading to the very anarchy the Constitution was intended to prevent? Separation of powers does not mean that the three branches of government do not influence one another, or that their actions can be coordinated. Publius remarks that Montesquieu, the great theorist of separation of powers, did not mean that these departments ought to have no partial agency in, no control over the acts of each other. To have completely separated legislative, executive, and judicial powers would have been to set up three separate governments, unable to affect one another at all, what the framers would call a hydra, a many-headed monster. Publius says that where the whole power of one department is exercised by the whole power of another department, the fundamental principles of a free constitution are subverted. What the framers wanted was rather powers independent from one another with respect to their capacities to make decisions, but interdependent if they actually want to get something done and to sustain that action over time. So, as we've seen, the legislature's power of the purse does not extend to the power to corrupt the president by altering his salary from one year to the next. Congress can, however, impeach the president and remove him from office, but only if one house impeaches or indicts and the other one convicts, and if the trial for his conviction or exoneration is presided over by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Similarly, the executive branch negotiates treaties, but these must go to the Senate for ratification. And further, cases under those treaties must be adjudicated by the Supreme Court, because treaties, like the Constitution itself, are the supreme laws of the land. In order to make separation and balance of powers work as a model of good government, each branch needs sufficient power to protect itself from encroachments by the other branches. At the same time, each branch must have an orderly way to coordinate government policies with the other branches. For example, who will control the apparatus, the administration of the American national state? Not Congress directly. As James Wilson argues at the convention, the principal reason for unity in the executive was that officers might be appointed by a single responsible person. At the same time, complete presidential control over appointments would allow a president to create offices and fill them with his favorites. Again, the solution was to divide and correlate two powers, giving nomination to the president and confirmation to the Senate. The sovereign people then can clearly observe who did what and hold each side responsible. It's this moral responsibility of the people's representatives to the people and of the people to themselves and to one another, right, that gives the American regime its distinctive character. If one nation under God means, in the words of the Declaration, that each of us must appeal to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, then what better way to mature us into the right exercise of that supreme responsibility by reinforcing our sense of responsibility to one another. That's what the constitutional separation and balance of powers is designed to do.